President Trump is not happy with Russian President Vladimir Putin, telling NBC News in a new interview this: "I was very angry, pissed off when Putin started getting into Zelensky's credibility because that's not going in the right location." Donald Trump told NBC's Kristen Welker. And because of that, the president is now apparently threatening to retaliate against Putin in this way. He says, if Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, but if I think it was Russia's fault, I'm going to put secondary tariffs on oil, on all oil coming out of Russia. So what now? Joining us right now is a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, Admiral James Stavridis. He's a partner at the Carlyle Group and serves on the board or advises or as an advisor for a handful of defense-related companies. He is also the author of the newly released book, The Admiral's Bookshelf. It's good to see you. Thank you so much for being here. So these are some of, I would say, Donald Trump's strongest words against Russia as we've been watching these negotiations kind of take place. What do you think of this?
Well, I find myself in agreement with President Trump. I'm pissed off at Vladimir Putin, too. So are 40 million Ukrainians, and so is any sensible person. We had to be angry with Putin because he invaded Ukraine. So I'm happy to hear the President of the United States express real frustration. But, Kate, will this go on? Is this performative at some level? Does it mean that sotto voce, off stage, Steve Witkoff is saying to Putin, you got to get to the table, or is this just a performance for the media? We don't know yet. I certainly hope there's sincere anger on the part of the President of the United States, because right now Putin is playing rope-a-dope with him and not moving forward on a ceasefire.
Because it does, and you pose the exact kind of state of play, which is the question, which is how real is this when you hear the president say this? Because do you even think the threat of sanctions or secondary tariffs is enough to bring Putin to the table on this?
I think it will influence Putin's decision making. It's probably necessary, but not quite sufficient to get him to the table. And Kate, worth pointing out two different things. Secondary tariffs would be much less of a hammer than secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions would mean you do business with Russia, you can't do business with the United States. Secondary tariffs mean you do business with Putin, we're going to tax your goods coming here. Note that the president talked about secondary tariffs. I hope he ratchets that up to secondary sanctions. That would get Putin's attention, believe me.
We also know that one thing that President Trump is keenly focused on is getting this rare earth minerals deal in place with Ukraine. And he talked to reporters about this last night. Let me play this for you.
And I think Zelensky, by the way, I see he's trying to back out of the rare earth deal. And if he does that, he's got some problems, big problems. We made a deal with rare earth, and now he's saying, well, you know, I want to renegotiate the deal. He wants to be a member of NATO. Well, he was never going to be a member of NATO. He understands that. So if he's looking to renegotiate the deal, he's got big problems.
So what the president might be referencing is Zelensky on Friday did kind of emphasize in a press conference Ukraine's not going to accept a deal that would jeopardize its accession to the European Union, saying that that cannot be accepted. What do you think of this? I mean, a negotiating position on the part of Ukraine, or really, I guess maybe more broadly, what do you think is or needs to be the priority for Ukraine in these very challenging talks now?
I think the idea of pushing for an immediate entrance to NATO on the part of Ukraine is simply a negotiating position. And you always start a negotiation with a maximalist position, and then you move toward reality in the center. I think that's what we'll see the Ukrainians do here. A near-term membership in NATO, very unlikely. Over time, not impossible. But a closer entrance into the European Union, that would be something I would push for very hard from the perspective of President Zelensky. Bottom line, the Ukrainians would be wise to get this mineral deal done. It's clearly something very important to President Trump. And aid to Ukraine is clearly very important to the Ukrainians. Let's construct a win-win outcome here. I think we can do that.
Admiral, it's good to see you. Thank you so much.
Let's turn to Donald Trump, who is warning of further tariffs on Russia after launching a scathing attack on the Russian president over the weekend. The US president used an expletive to describe his anger at Vladimir Putin, who had questioned the credibility of Ukraine's president as a leader. Mr. Putin had suggested putting Ukraine under, quote, temporary administration as a peace deal is negotiated. Donald Trump clarified his comments on Air Force One.
I think he'll be okay. But if he isn't, I was disappointed in a certain way. Some of the things that were said over the last day or two having to do with Zelensky, because when he considers Zelensky not credible, he's supposed to be making a deal with him, whether you like him or you don't like him. So I wasn't happy with that. But I think he's going to be good. And I certainly wouldn't want to put secondary tariffs on Russia, but if they were put on, it would not be very good for them.
Claire Sebastian is following the story from London for us. So, Claire, how do you read these comments about, let's say, Donald Trump being upset with Vladimir Putin? Is it an indication that he's changing his approach to Russia, or perhaps that he's maybe waking up to the idea, as critics have been espousing, that he's being played by Vladimir Putin?
So I think what you can read into it is that there's a real sense of frustration. I think it's interesting that the trigger appears to be Putin's comments last week that he wanted to bring in some kind of UN-brokered temporary administration in Ukraine to carry out the negotiations. Now, Putin has repeatedly questioned the credibility of Zelensky. This has been part of his rhetoric going forward. Many, of course, especially in Ukraine, have read this as yet more evidence of Russia's unwillingness to negotiate in good faith, that he's essentially pushing for regime change in Ukraine as part of it. And we've heard President Trump parrot some of this. He said just a few days after his very first call with Putin that President Zelensky was a dictator because he hadn't held elections last year, which, of course, as we know, it is not allowed under the Ukrainian constitution because martial law is in place. So it's interesting that that's the trigger. But I think what we're seeing is real frustration, right? Because where we are, big picture, is that the US proposed sort of overall ceasefire, a 30-day temporary ceasefire, was rejected by Putin. Then Putin said he was going to, sign on. He said he was going to give the order to stop attacks on energy infrastructure. Ukraine says that's been repeatedly violated. And then we had the situation where he said yes to a Black Sea ceasefire, but proceeded to attach conditions to that, including sanctions relief, which the US has not granted as of yet. So it's stalled at this point. So I think the frustration is breaking through. Now, I don't know if we can go as far as saying that he has understood that he's being played by Putin. There was a couch in there. He said if it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, but if it was Russia's fault, then I'm going to put secondary tariffs on oil coming out of Russia. So that's one thing. And I think the second thing to note is that if you look at the actual pressure that he's putting, the stick that he's threatening to bring to bear in the form of secondary tariffs, that we don't know how that's going to work. We don't know if it would work. This would mean putting sanctions on countries, third countries who import Russian oil, the likes of China and India. Now, the sanctions have been structured all along to allow this to happen so that Russia, which exports 10% of global oil, Russian oil would not come off the market, sending prices up for everyone. So I think that is one thing to consider. We don't know if he's going to do it yet. And I think that's why you see the Kremlin shrugging this off today and saying, actually, we're just going to continue with the work that we've been doing to restore bilateral relations and continue down, some kind of solution on Ukraine.
And meanwhile, there is still renewed scrutiny on Ukraine because Ukraine's President Zelensky said he's rejecting the US's latest deal on rare earth minerals. Just walk us through what we know about this new proposal from the United States, because it's not quite clear what's on the table.
Yeah, so what we know, a couple of sources familiar with the matter told us last week that the US had presented a new proposal to Ukraine. And this proposal, apparently, according to these sources, expanded on the original proposal, which, as you remember, was set to be signed on February 27th, the day of that Oval Office spat between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. It would give, apparently, the US more control over Ukraine's mineral wealth. It would include all minerals, including oil and gas, all sort of natural resources. And I think, look, we can see now a disconnect between the US position and Kiev, which may have led to President Trump's frustration. He then hit back at Ukraine over the weekend, saying that, Zelensky's trying to back out of the deal, because we did see Zelensky let slip significant frustration over this last week. He said on Thursday the US keeps changing the terms. He said that they'd introduced a whole new document. He talked about it again on Friday, which contained some things that hadn't been discussed, some things that had already been rejected. So I think Ukraine feels a little bit blindsided by this. They want to give it the proper legal scrutiny. And meanwhile, we still see this sort of sense of urgency from the Trump administration to push towards this deal, which, of course, is moot if we don't have a ceasefire. This is a post-war deal that we're talking about, the mineral deal.
All right, Claire, for now, thank you.